Hi, guys. So imagine it's 1920. 2 weeks ago, the women just got the vote for the first time in American history. Prohibition went into effect, which means every city in America is about to develop a secret drinking culture that'll be considerably more interesting than the drinking culture that it replaced. The economy is booming, jazz is happening, hemlines are rising, corset is gone, young women are cutting their hair short and rolling their stockings down and doing it all without chaperones, without permission. And the older generation is absolutely losing their mind about what's going on with the speakeasies, the flappers, women's freedom. The 1920s were the first decade in American history when a young woman being a young woman looked genuinely fun, right? When the culture started to acknowledge reluctantly and probably very anxiously, but acknowledge that women might actually have desires of their own, ambitions of their own, and wanting to meet their own pleasures. It was also the decade when the term gold digger first entered the popular vocabulary, when Broadway put gold diggers on the stage as heroines, and when Hollywood made them into stars. This is the next episode of Honey and Hustle, and this week we are going dancing. Yeah. I guess that's 70s. I don't know any 1920s, 20s songs to go along with that. Anyway, welcome back to Honey and Hustle. I am Wendy, and I'm writing a book in defense of gold diggers and sugar babies, and a not so serious history of American women using men to get what they want. And so we've spent several episodes talking about this whole phenomenon of gold diggers and women's place in society. And it's all building up to this moment, maybe, where we go back to the 20s, where the term actually burst onto the scene. So we've hit the decade that kind of crystallized that idea of women having transactional relationships with men to meet their needs. So we're kind of getting into something where it's starting to feel modern, okay? And it's starting to feel more established, and because we're naming it now. Before it went without name, and now we're actually putting a label on it. So the 1920s, let's get to it. Okay, so the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 18th, 1920. Women in the United States now had the right to vote. Taken only 72 years of organized struggle, and before that eons, right, to get there. 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, talking Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those women who were asking for it and trying to get it and mobilizing everybody. 72 years from that point to where women finally got that legal right to vote. And what that moment meant practically and symbolically, it can't even be overstated. Women were now, for the first time in American history, legally recognized as full citizens, not wards of their husband, not dependents, citizens, with a say in how the country was run. Now, there's a caveat here. It probably was just white women. We were still under terrible racial roads there for Black women and women of color. So this was truly probably just the first part where white women got the ability to vote and have a say or a role away from their husband. But that being said, it's still important. There was a enormous symbolic shift that kind of happened at this point, because the right to vote didn't immediately translate into economic equality, right? Women still couldn't open bank accounts in their own names in many states, and they still faced enormous blockades to having any kind of professional career. The Equal Rights Amendment, which would have guaranteed full legal equality, was first introduced in 1923 and would not be ratified for another century. Voting rights were the beginning, not the end. And it was, like I said, the beginning just for a certain class of women. But that was at least something that got things moving. So another thing that happened in the 20s, of course, Prohibition, which went into effect in January of 1920. It was supposed to clean up American society. It did the opposite, of course. We all know, a whole underground economy worth billions exploded, ran by organized crime, with tons of illegal bars called speakeasies, and patronized by everybody from the poor to the rich. Everybody wanted to be in on it. So here's what matters for our purposes. The speakeasy was one of the first genuinely mixed social spaces in American history. Men and women drank together in speakeasies. They danced together. They flirted. They made arrangements. That rigid social segregation of the Victorian era, where the men were in their clubs, women were in their parlors with their calling cards, drinking tea, that was dissolving in these basement bars all over the place, right? Suddenly you could be in the same room without a chaperone, without all that rigmarole Victorian idealism, morality facing you, right? So this is where the gold digger of the 1920s lived, not in a drawing room waiting to be presented in a speakeasy, choosing her own company, making her own assessments, running her own game. Okay? And then there's the flapper, the defining female image of the 1920s, right? If you get invited to a Great Gatsby party or 1920s party, you know exactly how to dress, right? You know, you want to do like short hair, put your hair up or do a little wig there or something. The dropped waist, rolled stockings, cigarette in one hand, cocktail in the other, dancing, maybe a little feather. Yes, entirely kind of concerned about what people think of you. That flapper in the 1920s, now it's kind of fun, right? But back in the 20s, that terrified people. Editorials in the newspaper were written about her. Sermons from the pulpit were delivered against her. Mothers wrung their hands because the flapper represented something that had not existed in American culture before. A young woman who was visibly, unapologetically pursuing her own pleasure. Not a wife, not a mother, not a daughter going along with her parents' family's respectability, just a woman who wanted to dance and smoke and drink and decide for herself who she went home with. So the flapper and the gold digger were kind of like cousins, right? They came from the same place, the growing recognition that women had desires of their own, and they terrified people for the same reasons. Both of them looked at the world and said, I want more, I want things, and I'm going to go get them, right? That's exactly what happened there. So we talked about Avery Hopwood back in another episode and how his encounter with Kay Laurel, the chorus girl, is where he first had heard that term in the Ritz-Carlton lobby, gold digger. And he's like, wow, that's interesting. So he went out and wrote a play about it. Became a huge Broadway hit called The Gold Diggers. And it was, again, right there in the 1920s, Hopwood kept writing because they were largely, hugely, increasingly popular and successful. So of course you're going to keep writing about it. The plays were comedies, but they were comedies with an argument embedded in them, an argument that the women who were called gold diggers were not shameful, but smart, and that the men who called them that were revealing more about their own anxiety than about that woman's behavior, right? So that's what kind of happened on the stage. There was some empowerment in this gold digging scene. Thank you, Avery Hopwood, with your plays that you wrote for Hollywood or for Broadway. But then Hollywood came in because, you know, if there's money to be made, here we are. They got a hold of the archetype and they made it even bigger, right? So Warner Brothers produced a whole series of gold digger musicals in the early 30s. Gold Diggers of 1933, Gold Diggers of 1935, Gold Diggers of 1970, you get the point. And you can find those somewhere. I'm sure they're all out there on YouTube, just look. And they were among the most successful films of their era. They had these great choreography and they were spectacular and, again, wildly popular. So the women in the chorus digger films, of course, and the gold digger film, the women in the gold digger films, of course, are all chorus girls. They're working class, they're struggling, and they're absolutely clear-eyed about their situation. They need money, and they know the most efficient route to money is through wealthy men. And they're not going to pretend otherwise. The films don't judge them for this. The films celebrate them for this. So here's what I find genuinely interesting about these films of the 30s. They were made during the Great Depression. Millions of Americans were out of work. Poverty was not an abstract concept by any means. It was a daily reality for a significant portion of the country. And in that context, the gold digger, that woman who refused to be destroyed by economic circumstances, who used her wits and her charm and her beauty to secure a better situation for herself, was not a villain, right? She was a survivor. She was doing what everybody in the audience wished they could do, right? And the films were, sure, they were fantasies, but they were fantasies that acknowledged the economic reality that that audience was living. And they consistently came down on the side of the woman who was resourceful enough to find a way through by just using her wits about her charm, and her beauty. That's not a small thing. These were mainstream Hollywood productions seen by millions of people. And they spent basically, 90 minutes, 2 hours, arguing that a woman who was strategic about money was not shameful, but admirable. So Hollywood was on the gold digger side. So that's interesting to me. So in a previous episode, I believe episode 2, I talked about the treating culture, right? Treating, which was that term, the practice of working class women accepting meals and entertainment and gifts from men in exchange for companionship. So in the 1920s, this exploded in scale and visibility, right? Because basically, let's go back to a sociologist, Kathy Pice, who in her research on working class women's leisure in the early 20th century documented that the treating economy, she documented the treating economy in great detail. And what she found was that working class women earning poverty wages in factories and domestic service, treating was not seen as a moral failing. It was a rational response to an irrational situation. And even at the time, people accepted it. They didn't see it as a moral failing. If anything, they thought maybe the men were preying on the women that they were treating. So if a factory girl in 1922 earning $8 a week couldn't afford to go out for a dinner, couldn't go to the dance halls, couldn't go to restaurants, couldn't go to the movie theaters and even see the movies about the gold diggers unless a man took her because he was making more money, right? In exchange, she gave him her company, sometimes more, but always on her own assessment of the terms, right? The women who operated within this economy, they didn't think of themselves as gold diggers. They thought of themselves as navigating the world that they knew, that they lived in, right? Not this fantasy life of that. So that gold digger label in the 1920s, as of now, was applied selectively, not to every woman who partook of a man's generosity, just to the ones who were most visible about it. Too unapologetic, too successful. The women who quietly accepted gifts and let a wealthy man pay for the evenings out was unremarkable. The women who did the same thing and then used those resources to build something, like we talked about those women who made museums to advance herself, to move into a different class, they were labeled gold diggers. That label tracked ambition more reliably than behavior, because the behavior was kind of across the board, right? Everybody had to get a man to get ahead. That's nothing new, especially when you were not making enough money to support yourself. You had to. It was just, that's the way it was. But if you use that to build yourself into something more, if you were too ambitious, then you became a gold digger, right? That's a pattern that we're going to just see. A woman who just survived, you're unremarkable. A woman who thrived, you're dangerous, you gold digger, you. So just so interesting. So the 1920s gold digger left us with something interesting. We now have names to it. We now have a face to it, that flapper girl, right? A wardrobe, a set of attitudes. She's smoking, she's drinking, she's dancing, right? She is glamorous. That's what the 1920s gave us. That's what we're seeing. And that image was constructed deliberately by Broadway and then by Hollywood. It was constructed in a specific way to make that gold digger entertaining rather than threatening, to frame her as a character in a comedy rather than just living her life in this terrible economic situation that she was in. And when you turn a real social phenomenon, this was interesting about any kind of art, any kind of film or play. When you take a real social phenomenon and turn it into a comedy, you do something useful to people who benefit from the status quo. You make it impossible to take seriously, right? The gold digger became funny, charming. Oh, I'll root for you for 2 hours, and then I'm going to forget about it when the lights come up. But what gets lost in all that framing was the economic reality that drove that phenomenon, right? The fact that the women were on the screen were entertaining fictions made urgent decisions that did no service to the women who were actually out there trying to survive on what little they were making in a world that paid them a fraction of what they paid men. So the comedies made the gold digger kind of lovable, and also they made it easier to dismiss her as a real subject, to say that's not a serious topic, that's just funny, that's a farce. And in doing that, they made it easier for us to avoid asking harder questions about wages, about property rights, about the economic structure in place that even made that strategy necessary. So that's why we're still having this conversation, because the underlying dynamics did not move on. The pay gap did not close. Still today, men have more assets than us. Men make more money than us. And the cultural expectation on women to be beautiful and charming and fantastic is still here. So that's why this channel exists. That's why this book's getting written, because the 1920s gave us this whole gold digger phenomenon as a cultural figure. And the culture did its best to make sure we didn't think too hard about it, to make us think it was funny and glamorous and charming. And then there was the backlash, which we'll talk about in another episode, that happens after that. But at that time in the 20s, it was seen as funny. It was great. We can just forget about things. When the 30s, 40s, we hit wartime, then there became a backlash against these women who were too frivolous and fantastic. So we've covered a lot of ground here in these episodes. Next week, I'm going to probably, well, maybe I'll delve into that 30s and the backlash. We'll see. Or maybe I'll go and talk about another Peggy Hopkins Joyce or some other glamorous woman of the 20s. I don't know yet. I'll find out. But have you seen any of these gold digger movies from the 30s? Look them up on YouTube. They're pretty fantastic, pretty charming and hilarious. And what do you think of what happened? Do you think that Hollywood did us a disservice by making it funny, or do you think they actually gave women some power and making them seem strategic on the stage? Let me know in the comments. I would love to know. And of course, hit subscribe so you can keep seeing my episodes come out, and give me more ideas for videos. I'd love to hear who you think is gold digger, and we will figure that out in depth together. So thank you, and have a great day.